Welcome between the listeners. I'm your host Joe Chapin. Today we are going to be going through something that might confuse Tiger fans and Red Wing fans because we are going to mix them together, and we're going to kind of go into what Steve Eisman and Scott Harris are doing is the smart approach. And I'm going to go through it. We're going to go through it, and you can let me know in the comments below if I'm off the mark. But I don't think I'm off the mark because I've talked to people who know more than me that are suggesting the same thing. So when you look at the Detroit Tigers, when you look at the Detroit Red Wings, Scott Harris and Steve Yzerman are taking this patient approach to their prospects. They're not going to rush them up. Scott Harris ruffled some feathers last night with the Bailey Sports podcast where he was saying he's not going to rush Colt Keith up. He's not going to rush, a guy like Parker Meadows or Justin Henry Malloy up. He's not going to do that. Now, when you talk about rushing a guy up, what do you mean? Now, when you talk about rushing a guy up, potentially what you mean is that the Detroit Tigers could rush a guy up that's not ready. He's not familiar with the nuances of the game. And when he comes to the big leagues, the pitches are faster, the pitches are stronger, they have more command of the fastball and all of their pitches, to be honest. And you don't have the same leeway you had in AAA. So that's one thing. And on the NHL side, when you go from the AHL to the NHL, the gaps are smaller. There's not much room to maneuver like there is in the AHL. The players are faster, they're stronger, and they understand their assignments at every given turn. When I look at the Detroit Tigers and I look at the Detroit Red Wings, in the past, the general managers have made crucial mistakes that have prolonged rebuilds to their significant teams. When we talk about the Detroit Red Wings and we talk about the Detroit Tigers, there's two players that kind of have, they're starting to get some slack. And one player in particular, Philip Zadina, is going to be put on unconditional waivers for contract termination later today. And when we talk about Spencer Torkelson, take this with a grain of salt. Spencer Torkelson has all the room to grow. He has all the room to grow. But I'm bringing up one simple point. Now, you're going to ask me, why am I bringing up Spencer Torkelson? Why am I bringing up Philip Zadina? And why am I mixing it together? Just stay tuned. So, look, when Spencer Torkelson was drafted, there was a high, degree of he's going to be a guy who's going to be a really good bat in the major league lineup, and he's going to be, when he's ready, he's going to be a significant player in your lineup. When the Red Wings drafted Philip Zadina, they were Zadina was thought of as a guy who could score goals at a significant pace, be an NHL goal scorer, and neither has happened to either. Pretty much, like, I don't think Torkelson has lived up to the pick that he was, and I don't think Zadina, obviously, he didn't live up to the pick he was. And when you look into both situations of those general managers, one was Ken Holland and one was Al Avila. And I have my own thoughts on Al Avila, and I'm going to get to that later. But when you look at Al Avila and Ken Holland, when they were at the end of the road in Detroit, I felt like they rushed guys up to save face. So a guy like Philip Zadina was rushed up because the Detroit Red Wings needed offense. And, Ken Holland thought, maybe if I insert this guy in the lineup right now, he will be ready and, let's take a shot. Same thing with Spencer Torkelson. I thought Al Avila brought Spencer Torkelson up because, number one, the team at the time was just awful and they were not getting people in the gates and they were not competitive and they were really just an awful watch. And if you can bring up Spencer Torkelson, you can bring up Riley Green, maybe you have something in the pike. And Riley Green, he started off a little slow, but he's becoming a really good player. But Spencer Torkelson, through the first year and a half, he's struggled to be a significant player that you thought he was going to be. In both instances, you look at both players. You look at both the general managers and the position that they put their players into. They rushed Torkelson up. I'm firmly a believer in that. And I talked to a guy who he was a former third baseman in Major League Baseball. He didn't last that long because, honestly, he even said, like, they rushed me up too soon and I didn't know half of the things I know now. And when I was rushed up, I wasn't ready at all. And he said, I could see some of the signs that he was rushed up to the majors because There's things that he is doing in his mechanics that are not helping his game. And I asked him, what is that? And he was going into nuances of like the foot placement, being slow on a breaking ball, or being, he's got the power. He's a great player, Torkelson. He was talking about. He's got the power. He's got the discipline, but he's just not seeing the ball. He kind of skipped that AAA, graduation ceremony to get to the Major League Baseball. He's like, it's like if you go from high school to college and you think you're ready for a college test, you're out of your mind. Now, I'm going to tie them both together again. With Philip Zadina, like, Ken Holland thought he was going to be a guy who could score pucks and put pucks in net, and that was a famous quote that Zadina had. But that didn't happen either, and it never really materialized in Detroit. And he had opportunities, and Steve Yzerman even gave Zadina opportunities, and it just never happened. So when you look at both players and you look at both organizations who are owned by the same person, Chris Ilitch, I think what you're starting to see is they're more patient with their prospects. Now, it used to be the Detroit Red Wings were patient with their prospects. And honestly, when we talk about the Detroit Tigers, they've really never had a prospect system that has materialized great players over time. They don't have a prospect system like the Atlanta Braves or the St. Louis Cardinals or the San Francisco Giants, okay? So what I'm starting to see is Yzerman and Harris are taking the same exact approach, but different timelines. Harris is obviously just starting his rebuild, and Yzerman is just starting to peak out of the rebuild. But when you look at both general managers, they've taken a patient approach to the way that they develop their prospects, because the number one lifeblood in any sport is the guys that you draft, because they're cheap. You can get and you can develop them, and you can get them back to you can put them in the best positions to succeed. When I look at the Detroit Red Wings and I look at the Detroit Tigers, they're obviously on different timelines. But when you look at the Detroit Tigers, there's no salary cap, so they can get better quicker than you can in the NHL, because there is a salary cap and you got to deal with that in the NHL. But what Harris and Yzerman are doing is the correct approach. And I know fans are upset. They don't want to wait for this prospect to come up, and they don't want to wait for this guy to come up. But the reality of the situation is this: if you make the wrong decision and you bring up a prospect too soon, you are adding years onto your rebuild. You have to be coherent on what you're doing, because yeah, if it's like if you're if you're borrowing money against your savings, okay? You're taking money out of your savings to, for right now, and then when you need it, it's not there. Now, what Steve Yzerman and Scott Harris are doing is they're taking a methodical way, which can really frustrate some fans, and I understand that it can frustrate some fans. But what Scott Harris and Steve Yzerman are doing is ultimately it's going to help them build winners in continuous fashions. You're not going to have this where you got to rebuild every 6 years. You're not going to rebuild every 4 years. You're not going to rebuild every 8 years. You're trying to get this going and keep it going, because when you can draft and develop at a high level, you can just put a player in that let's say you had a player that you couldn't afford to pay, and you could put someone up from the AAA, they're ready to go, or the AHL, and they're ready to go, and you have a good stable of guys. So look, we could sit here all day long. We could talk about Scott Harris and Steve Yzerman, how the methodical way that they're going is annoying, because when you watch these two teams, you're more left sick than happy most times. But when you look at the totality of both rebuilds, both teams will be better suited with these methodical approaches than they will with the Ken Holland and Al Avila approach, which is rush these guys up and then hope they get it together at the major league level. I think a lot of people, when we look at Al Avila, when we look at Ken Holland, especially Ken Holland, the later years sucked for him. and he wasn't any good, and it really set the Red Wings back. And Al Avila, he's one of the worst general managers in Detroit history. Let's just put that, Frank. He was absolutely awful. But when you look at the two, they rushed players up to kind of save their ass, and at that same time, they basically put years onto the rebuild that you weren't expecting. So, I know a lot of fans are sick of this rebuild. They're sick of the rebuilds with the Tigers and the Red Wings, but the Red Wings appear to be getting out of that rebuild, and the Tigers are probably just starting. So the methodical way is the correct way. Now, there's ways you can speed up the process, but those require money. Those require, in the case of the NHL, you can't just spend money to spend money. You have to, signify with the cap. And the same thing with Major League Baseball. Like you can't overspend just to spend and try to get yourself out of it. That doesn't work. So when you look at both teams, the methodical way is the patient way. I know it's annoying for fans, but it has to happen this way to build a long time winner. And I think that both the Red Wings and the Tigers will eventually be really good under Scott Harris and Steve Yzerman, because I think that they're going to be built the right way, and the prospects were brought up at the right time for both the Tigers and the Red Wings. We will talk to you on the next Between the Whistles YouTube video. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe. I will appreciate it. I'm gonna have Detroit sports content you know, um, all year long as we go into football, hockey, basketball, baseball. We talked a little bit of baseball, but honestly, there's really nothing to talk about with the Tigers. They are not a fun. They they were fun for a short period of time, but we're getting out of it, and it's just going to be interesting to watch how the Tigers rebuild this thing in a patient approach.